And this is not a lecture like the Institute of Catholic Culture to 2,000 people, right? This is a conversation. And so we're really thinking with Newman, and we want to enter into the realities of what he's writing about, and we want to seek to understand them together and to apply them. And one of the things that's wonderful about this work is that it's not simply Newman's abstract thinking about what a university is. They're lectures that he actually gave to a group of people who were starting a school, the Catholic University of Ireland in Dublin. And so it really was an interpersonal work that he's trying to enter more deeply into the reality of the university with a group of people. And I think that's really our foundation for what we're trying to do here. So I will not be lecturing, for 2 hours. Obviously I'm going to be setting up our discussion of the material, but we really do want everyone to be a part of this conversation and to be interacting as much as possible. So yeah, that's right. We have the Newman centers throughout the country, which are named after St. John Henry Newman, although they were named that even long before he was a saint. And so that tells you something about the importance of not only Newman, but also this work that we would name our Catholic ministry centers after him throughout the country. So a lot of you expressed that you're pretty new to Newman. And so that's where I wanted to hear, okay, how much of a background do you need even about the life of Newman and his thought? And it sounds like that would be helpful. So Newman wrote about the development of doctrine throughout church history, but he lived that to some degree. He had a great development within his own religious formation. He was born in London in 1801, and his dad, was upper middle class banker. And so he sent him to what they call in England, the public schools. And public schools in England are actually private schools. So like a private boarding school. And he received a really excellent classical education. I kind of laughed that I've been involved in the classical education movement, and we say, yeah, I'm starting a classical school. And so, the kids will learn a little bit of Latin. And, Newman was like composing Latin and Greek poetry, when he was in like elementary school. Yeah, he was classically educated. And so from a very young age, he immersed himself into the classics. But he had his first religious conversion at the age of 15. And so he said up to that point, he was from a Christian background, but it was actually through one of his teachers when he was in the high school level that helped guide him to what he called more of an evangelical conversion. And so Newman actually became influenced by Calvinist theology. And from that age, he actually believed that the Catholic Church, and the Pope was the Antichrist, right? And so the Catholic Church was the whore of Babylon and all that kind of thing that comes from the Reformation, and believed in Calvinist theology. And so he came to Oxford then as a Calvinist. And as an undergraduate, what you have to do at Oxford is that, you take courses that they're lectures, but you're also being guided by a tutor at the same time. And so, we're going to get into this over the course of the class, but there's actually 2 different layers of education at Oxford. And Newman was really big on this. You had the university, and there were chairs at the university for professors to teach in particular subjects. But how did they teach? They would simply get up and they would read a very formal lecture that they would prepare. It's almost like most of the time, they would even publish their lectures as books. So you can imagine a very thick book that is being written by a professor and then read out loud. And that's what lectures were like. And so these young students sometimes, had a hard time with that. And so they would also have tutors who, in the context of the college, they would be residents of a college. They would be guided in their studies, and the tutors would often even tell them what lectures to attend and would help them to prepare for exams. Actually, the British government got involved in the management of Oxford and bringing in outside examiners to make sure that the students were proficient to pass their exams. And Newman actually prepared so hard for his exams as he was a resident of Trinity College that he basically had a nervous breakdown and he passed his exams, but below mark. So he was basically, kind of, you could say passed, but with a negative mark on his studies. And yet, despite that, one particular college really saw his promise, Oriel College, and he was voted in, right? There were some additional exams you had to do if you wanted to continue your studies. We kind of think of this almost like a graduate student. So he was admitted as a fellow of Oriel College, despite, his bad previous undergrad exams. And he says that this is really where his intellectual life came alive. So kind of during this period of graduate study. And he initially was influenced by a group of teachers at Oriel who were called the Noetics. And they were actually a bit rationalist in their theology. And so Newman says he was kind of briefly taken into a more kind of rational and even liberal to some degree, that is emphasizing reason even over revelation. And so that helped to pull him out of Calvinism, but kind of left him a little bit unmoored, right, in this intellectual climate at Oxford. But he was then made a tutor. So, I mentioned that the undergrads would have these tutors to guide them through their studies. And so after some additional studies at Oriel, he was then made a tutor there. And this is really where he came into his own. And he was influenced by a fellow tutor named Froude, who was influenced by one of his teachers, Keble. And so these two figures, Keble and Froude, are the ones who brought Newman into a more traditional Anglicanism. And while he was a tutor, he was actually ordained a priest of the Anglican Church, right? So as a fellow and then tutor at Oriel, he was actually ordained an Anglican clergy member. And so while he was a young clergy member, he became a part of a more traditional movement to try to bring the Church of England back to its roots in the Apostolic Church and the Church of the Fathers. And so this was basically an Anglo-Catholic group, right? So he went from being a Calvinist to being influenced by this more rationalist or liberal theology, to then becoming very much influenced by the church's history of theology. And this really set him on the trajectory that would eventually lead him to the Catholic Church. But it would also cause a conflict within Oriel College. He was basically expelled as a tutor because of the conflict between this more traditional group that he was a part of and the more liberal group that was in charge of the college itself. But Newman actually had a bigger platform at Oxford. He became vicar of St. Mary's, and so he was basically the priest over the parish, the main parish for university students. And somebody mentioned his plain and parochial sermons. Those are the sermons he gave at St. Mary's, and they were highly influential. Newman was very soft-spoken, but in St. Mary's, the church would be packed by undergraduate students hanging on his every word, listening very carefully, to Newman's intonation. And Newman was a great orator. I mean, people recognize that, even who aren't Catholic, who aren't Christian. Newman is taught in English classes, especially those focused on Victorian prose. And so Newman, hands down, was a great orator. And beyond even his sermons at St. Mary's, he gave what were called university sermons, where the whole university would officially be gathered together to hear sermons. And that goes back even to the Middle Ages. Medieval professors gathered for disputations, for sermons, and then they would conduct their own lecturing. But those were the three major duties of university teachers: to preach, to dispute, and to lecture. And it was actually those university sermons that formed the basis of my own master's work on faith in Newman. They were on the relationship between faith and reason. But going back to that conflict that Newman had at Oriel College, he became a key figure in what was called the Tractarian movement. Newman wrote the first of what became many tracts written by different authors called the Tracts of the Times. And they were a rallying cry to the Church of England to reconnect to its lost Catholic traditions. And so over the course of a number of years, Newman wrote many of these tracts, which culminated in the infamous Tract 90, in which he said the 35 articles, which were the articles of belief of the Anglican Church, could actually be interpreted in a Catholic sense, that they didn't actually exclude Catholic belief, but only certain exaggerations of Catholic belief. And for that tract, Newman was disciplined and silenced by his bishop. And so he ended up retiring to a smaller church that was dependent on St. Mary's out in the country at Littlemore. And eventually he just resigned his position at St. Mary's altogether, and then had to resign his fellowship at Oriel. In 1845, so he was 44 years old, he made the decision, after kind of seeing that the Tractarian movement being dead-ended, to become a Catholic. And at that point, he actually had very little contact with Catholics. He met some during his very influential Mediterranean travels, in which he actually saw Catholic worship for the first time, and encountered the future Cardinal Wiseman in Rome. But he really was venturing into the unknown. His life was a life based in Oxford. And his vision of university life really revolved around relationships. So like those relationships with his fellow tutors and with his students. It was very much a communal pursuit of the truth that would really shape one's life and form the basis of a strong community, which we saw both at Oriel College, but then also within his parish at St. Mary's, and the little monastery that he formed at Littlemore before he became Catholic. And I think it's for those reasons that when he did then go to Rome to study to become a priest, he was ordained a couple of years after his conversion, he chose to become an Oratorian. And that was the order founded by St. Philip Neri. Neri was the apostle of Rome, right? Not of the Indies, not of the Americas. St. Philip Neri came to Rome and established a center there and mentored people in one place, formed relationships with them, and really engaged in that interpersonal communion that was so important in Newman's own life and work. And so he took that back with him to England. He was actually given the blessing of the Pope to bring the Oratarians to England for the first time. And so he settled down in Birmingham, originally at the Maryvale location, where I know many people who have studied there and gotten degrees there. But it was really when he was a fresh convert, just kind of settled in Birmingham, that he received a very unusual call from the future Cardinal Archbishop of Dublin, Paul Cullen, who was not a cardinal yet, but he was already the apostolic delegate. So the Pope basically put him in charge of the Church of Ireland. And, you know, if you've ever been to Ireland, you know that Catholic churches there are pretty new. They were only built in the 19th century, and all the old medieval churches are, for the most part, owned by the Anglican Church of Ireland. Because Catholics only received legal emancipation in the British Isles in 1829, right? So Newman's conversion was 1845. Catholics were only newly emancipated. So you could imagine his conversion and his kind of fallout with all his old friends at Oxford when he was becoming part of a scorned group. And there was deep anti-Catholic prejudice in England at the time. I mean, long-standing prejudice. And so only after 1829 could Catholics in Ireland build their own churches and found their own schools. And so there actually had never been a full-fledged university, Catholic university in Ireland. There was an attempt in the 14th century to start a university in Dublin, but it failed. And so Newman was being called to do something pretty amazing, but surprising, that here he is, a fresh convert. He's English. You can imagine that maybe the English and Irish didn't get along at that time, because the English had basically colonized Ireland and made the Irish to be serfs. And then they finally have legal emancipation. They can finally start their own schools. And Archbishop Cullen says, we're going to tap an Englishman to be the founder of this university. And there was some animosity about that. That actually made people pretty uncomfortable, and it did make things difficult for Newman. And Colin ultimately wasn't happy about the way that Newman set up the school. Newman wasn't fired or anything, and Colin didn't even want him to resign when he did. But Newman really wanted to have a lot of laity involved in the university that he was founding. He did not want the university to kind of be like a seminary and even to have that feel. He wanted it to be open. He wanted the students to engage in recreation and to have freedom. And that made some people in the kind of newly freed Catholic Church in Ireland uncomfortable. So it was a very difficult project, and Newman basically saw it as a failure, right? So we're reading the glorious fruits of his, what he saw to be a somewhat futile enterprise to start a new university in Ireland. That school is still going. It's now called the University College Dublin. So it was called the Catholic University of Ireland when he founded it, but it is still there. But it wasn't what Newman really wanted it to be. And so it never fully lived up even to the ideals that we're going to be reading about in the book. So Newman went back to Birmingham pretty discouraged, and it's when he goes back that he founds the oratory school there that he will oversee for the rest of his life. And Newman's life as a Catholic was actually fairly quiet. I mean, he got involved in some public disputes, which led to the writing of the Apologia Pro Vita Sua, the kind of the defense of his conversion. He got involved in another kind of public debate about the First Vatican Council and papal infallibility and how that should be interpreted, because people in England thought that meant that Catholics had to just believe whatever the Pope said about anything and would be bound to him in even all political decisions, right? And so Newman said, no, right? That's not what this is really about, with his famous letter to the Duke of Norfolk. But even in the Catholic Church in England, Newman was somewhat marginal. And butted heads with the powers to be. And so he was vindicated by being made a cardinal towards the end of his life in 1879. I mean, he died in 1890, right? So he was a cardinal for, a little more than 10 years at the very end of his life. But he led a somewhat retired life in the sense that he was actually never ordained a bishop, right? So he didn't have like a large pastoral assignment. He never got involved in university life after he left Dublin. He followed the example of St. Philip Neri, right? To be placed in one particular spot in Birmingham, where he had his oratory church, his oratory school. He very much invested in the relationships with his fellow oratorians, with his students, with the community there. And I think that's something very beautiful about Newman's own approach to education. Okay, so that's just a little bit of a background about who Newman is and his involvement with education. And that comes out a little bit in our reading, right? So I don't know if you got the recommended Clooney edition. Part of the reason why this is recommended, and this was recommended even by AMI before I agreed to teach the class, but it does have the introduction by my mentor who taught me Newman, Don Briel. And Don founded the program of Catholic Studies at the University of St. Thomas, where I got my undergrad and master's degrees, which I think in many ways was an attempt to live out Newman's ideals within, it's almost was like a mini college, right, within the university. That my alma mater, the University of St. Thomas, has gone off the deep end, unfortunately, right? But the Catholic Studies program was an enclave to try to give us the kind of experience that Newman wrote about in the idea of a university, and to really root us more deeply in the Catholic tradition in general. But there's another thing that I wanted to mention about this edition. If you have it, I think this is very helpful, that if you look towards the back here, starting at page 401, there is a good number of notes. So they are both historical notes, there's translations, when Newman has, Latin or sometimes other languages that are used in the text. And so there's definitely some points that I think would be obscure without those notes. So you might even want to consider getting this edition for that reason if you don't have a copy. I will also be giving some other recommendations because, as I mentioned, these are lectures that Newman gave to the community, the university community in Dublin. But even while he was doing that, he was also writing historical sketches about the whole history of universities. And so they were published as volume 3 of Newman's historical sketches. You can find those online at a great website. I'm going to put it in the chat box here, newmanreader.org, which is a really phenomenal resource for Newman. And you can find all of his published works there, even some of his letters and diaries and other even secondary sources about Newman. And then there's some other great works that Newman wrote about education as well. Some of them are shorter, like his essay on the mission of the Benedictines and the Benedictine schools, the Tamworth Reading Room, but also a really important sermon. So there's one sermon in particular, which he gave for the Feast of St. Monica, which is included in a different volume of his sermons. The ones that I mentioned previously were Anglican sermons, right? But I'm going to give a link to that. So that is at least one additional writing of his on education that I want to make sure that we talk about in the class. So I will be sending a link to that one and maybe just some other suggestions as well based on some of the other works that I mentioned. Okay, so that's my introduction. Now, I was trying to give just a very general kind of thrust of Newman's life. But what really drove his conversion from the Anglican Church into the Catholic Church was his realization that what he was trying to do with the Tractarian movement, which was to reintegrate the Anglican Church into the great Catholic tradition, was not possible, because at a certain point, the Anglican Church had really veered off from the great tradition of the church. And so he came to the realization that the Church of the Apostles is the Catholic Church. And in fact, the Church of England deviated from the apostolic tradition. So that was really the crux of his own, I would say, crisis within the Anglican Church. But to go to the Catholic Church, he still needed more. Okay, it's one thing to kind of recognize within the apostolic church certain beliefs, but what about what I see in the Catholic Church right now? Is there really a direct connection between the apostles and the church fathers and Catholic devotion to Mary, or the way that Catholics articulate the authority of the papacy? And so Newman wrote a great work, and it's read by many converts, his essay on the development of Christian doctrine. So a lot of times when people say that they've read Newman, I hear that's the work that they've read. Or also his Apologia Pro Vita Sua, which I mentioned briefly, described his life all the way up to his conversion. And one of the things that Newman points out in the Apologia is that without authority, that the integrity of God's revelation would be jeopardized. There would be no way, simply based on, individual opinion or argumentation, to be able to ascertain what God had truly revealed and what he did not, and what was a true development and what was not a true development. And so, in addition to historical continuity, Newman also recognized the need for authority instituted by Christ himself in the church, which was fundamentally lacking in Protestantism. And so he had the famous phrase in his essay on the development of Christian doctrine, "To be deep in history is to cease to be Protestant." Okay, so I just wanted to make sure that we kind of hit that central aspect of Newman's conversion. But now we're going to get into the first half of Newman's idea of a university, because if you look at the table of contents, there really are two very distinct works within this one book. The first section, the first half, is on university teaching, and it actually is comprised of a bunch of discourses that Newman had published previously as a standalone volume, which were on the aims and principles of education. One of those discourses dropped out. So I'm actually going to give you a link to that lost discourse that didn't make it into this volume. And when you look at the second half, was on university subjects. So we're kind of moving from an overall view of the nature of the university to looking at what is taught in particular within the university curriculum. So our reading for today was on the preface and then the introductory discourse. And the preface gives us the most meat, I think, because it is an overview of what he is arguing as a whole within the book. And so I just want to start with a discussion of how that opens. So if you have this volume, it's on page 5. But if you are just kind of reading along from a different version, this is just the very beginning of the preface itself. So Newman begins. The view taken of a university in these discourses is the following: that it is a place of teaching universal knowledge. This implies that its object is, on the one hand, intellectual, not moral. Right? We want to unpack that more. And on the other hand, that it is the diffusion and extension of knowledge rather than the advancement. If its object were scientific and philosophical discovery, I do not see why a university should have students. If religious training, I do not see how it can be the seat of literature and science. Such is a university in its essence and independently of its relation to the church. Actually, you know what? I'm going to stop there because I want to come back to that next paragraph, but I just want to sit on that first paragraph, that the purpose of the university is to teach universal knowledge, to offer intellectual formation, not moral formation, to diffuse knowledge rather than to advance it, right? So he's saying that the primary purpose of a university is not research. And that would be news to a lot of universities in the United States. Okay, so let's just pause there for a second. What do you think about that first paragraph, about what Newman is saying about the university in its essence?
It seems to me like it's totally aimed to the students, because it's about it's not about being a professor and having like an excellent position. It's about diffusing knowledge. It's not about more. It's about forming intellectually. So it seems to me like it's for the students. It's not a profession.
Yeah, exactly. And in that first discourse that we read, the introductory one, he says that. He says, why did Pope Pius IX think that it was important that Ireland has a Catholic university? Well, for the students, right? You know, not that Ireland should have this place of research, right? But, you know, it's for the benefits of the students themselves. So that's a big point, that a university should be student focused and that it is diffusing knowledge to them for their intellectual formation. Now, of course, this is only one paragraph, but it's a rich paragraph. Anything else? I mean, that could be controversial in particular to say that it's intellectual formation and not moral formation. But was anybody taken aback by that?
I was thinking of Aristotle, who would talk about, moral is practical wisdom, right? So it's morality is, we tend to think of morality purely in terms of, these are the dictates of what you can or cannot do, right? But, in the broader sense of morality as what you should do under particular circumstances, which at times we might not think of that as morality, but it's, it's the right and the wrong that will lead to happiness and such. what I find interesting is that, I mean, so when you go further, and even in the first discourse, when he's talking about University of Education, he does talk very much in terms of intellectual formation, which is more of a leading to a way of thinking, a process, a way of coming at things. And to me, I distinguish that very much from knowledge. So I find it kind of interesting that he starts by saying it's teaching universal knowledge, but then he says it's intellectual, not moral, and goes into all of the purposes, all of the value of education informing the mind. Well, to me, that's much more than teaching knowledge, right? Even is it in Proverbs, or I don't remember which, but there's one of the Proverbs where they talk about knowledge and wisdom and the hierarchy of things, and wisdom and the formation of the mind and the intellectual ability is not quite the same. So to me, I actually find that a little bit confusing. That I think he does mean formation of the mind, but when he says teaching universal knowledge, that actually seems to me a little bit limiting on what he actually thinks it's supposed to do.
Yes, and so it's a very important point, because if you look at what he means by universal knowledge, it means that a university doesn't teach just one area of human life, to say, we're just going to have an arts program. Okay, but an arts program cannot be a university, or a trade school cannot be a university, because a university treats the whole of knowledge. Now, if students come to the university for knowledge, then it is a question of, well, how do they really gain that knowledge? What is the way that they come to know things about human life and about the world? And I think this is where Newman would say, as they are acquiring that knowledge in the right way, they are gaining an intellectual formation. Because someone who simply looks up information on Wikipedia, for instance, would not actually have the formation of learning that in the context of a university, right? And you could actually say, well, I learned about the Battle of Gettysburg at university. And somebody could say, oh, well, I read that on Wikipedia. And I think that the process of, say, reading a text and discussing it with a professor and writing a paper about it, all of that will form a kind of discipline in thinking and expression that would not simply happen if the end was only to gain a piece of information, right? But on the other hand, you could say, well, how do you really gain intellectual formation? Is it just thinking? And we say, no, it's thinking about something, right? There has to be some object to the thinking, and that is the knowledge that is gained in university teaching. And I think the distinction that you made earlier about intellectual versus practical formation is also very important, because you might think, oh, well, Newman thinks that, therefore the university shouldn't teach about morality. Well, that's not what he said, right? If you had a class on the virtues, would that be intellectual formation or moral formation? It's intellectual, right? Because you're learning about the virtues. It's actually not moral formation. What does he mean by moral formation? I mean, that's probably something good to talk about here, right? What do you think it means by that?
So I actually just have a question still about that, like the distinction he's drawing between the university being for intellectual formation versus moral formation. And this might get at your question, because a few pages later, he uses this term moral disability. But he connects the idea of a moral disability to the fact that Catholic students in Ireland don't have access to this kind of education as Catholic students. And that really confused me, because I thought the purpose of the university was for intellectual formation, not moral formation, yet the Catholic students in Ireland have a moral disability because they don't have access to higher education. And then a few pages later, he uses the language of evil, that people are subjected to everyday evils because people do not have intellectual formation. or rather people lack these intellectual virtues. So is there, I'm trying to like work through what that means, that you could have a moral disability because you lack intellectual formation, but intellectual formation is not the same thing as moral formation. So is it that you acquire one as you're acquiring the other? Is there like, I don't think that's necessarily true though, but yeah.
So this is a really important question. It's one of the stickiest in the book, I think, because some people think that, well, Newman said it's about intellectual formation and therefore moral formation doesn't matter. And he's not saying that at all, right? So I think it has to do with what he thinks the university is about, right? The university is a place to come to learn knowledge about things. And in that learning of knowledge, as we were just saying, that the mind would itself take on certain dispositions and habits of thinking. And based on the quotes that you just mentioned, well, maybe intellectual virtues are pretty important for the moral life. So maybe there's a connection, right? So this brings you back to that question. What do you think he means by moral formation? Learning about virtue is intellectual formation, right? So learning what a good life is intellectual formation. And so why is it that the university would not give moral formation then? Anybody have thoughts on that? What do you think the distinction is here? Patrick pointed us to that a little bit already, but how do you gain moral formation, and why is that not the purview of the university?
Moral formation is habitual. It's actions. It's not intellect. So the intellect should be leading. If you have prudence, the prudence leads you to right action. But having knowledge per se is not prudence. Prudence is how to actually enact with all your passions and your will, enact the various virtues. So it is important to learn about the virtues intellectually in order to become habitual. Now, I'm not sure that he doesn't think that the role of a university will actually be somewhat moral. I mean, if you have tutors who are dealing with you on a personal level, like the lecture, you're not going to get any moral education from your lectures. You're going to get maybe a knowledge of what the virtues are and so on.
Yeah, which is still
with your interaction with your tutor, on the other hand, you may not explicitly, but he's also, I think, I don't know, if the university had sort of an in parento locus, or what is it, in the place of parents, role to play as well. So when kids get out of line, you have to discipline them, you have to keep them in order, and that's all part of a moral formation. But it's not the end of a university education. I mean, it's part of what's just necessary for the community to survive, right? I mean, you can't have kids jumping off of buildings and doing whatever. I mean, whatever, just so anyway, I guess the distinction is between what the purpose of the education itself is and the difference between what actual moral education is actually practical. I mean, it is getting it into your bones, not just getting it into your intellect.
Yeah. Now, one clarification, because you mentioned the tutor. Yeah. Well, for Newman, the tutor resides where?
In the house where
the college, right? And so we would think, in America, we'd say college, university. I guess university is just a bigger college. We don't use those terms in the same way. And so what Newman is saying is that attending lectures at the university is for gaining knowledge. And if you go to a lecture on the virtues, will the professor be responsible for you living the virtues by the end of that class? No, right? He just wants to make sure you understand what the virtues are. Does that mean that university students should not be receiving moral formation from someone? Newman says, yeah, they need it, but it's not the job of the professors. It's the job of other people in conjunction with the university. And this is actually a big problem, because I would say, like, even Catholic colleges in the US, most of them, not those on the Newman Guide, but would say, yeah, university is just about intellectual or practical formation. We don't give moral formation. And so there's no moral formation at all, you know? And Newman would be like, no, that's not it. Alex, looks like you want to jump in here, so go ahead.
Yeah, I would just say, I think you're right, Todd. When Newman says it's not he's basically saying moral formation is not the object, it's not the proper object, but it will happen in the course of the habituation of the life of the mind in a community. And I think this is nicely related to, there's an either or that Newman sets up later on whether you would want a kind of perfect education that wasn't in community, almost like a total distance learning and a certification that you did on your own, or if you just had students in a college with no tutor and no exams, he'd take the latter, because that moral, because you'd still get the intellectual habituation, but you'd also have the community and its moral cohesiveness, where each member is growing in all aspects of moral and intellectual and religious perfection at the same time, but the proper object is the intellectual.
Yeah, and I think that's what we're really lacking. You know, I was doing a podcast before this class started with John Johnson, and he was saying, where do you see Newman's ideal being lived out? And I was like, nowhere, right? In the sense that you don't see his vision of the way that the university and the college would work together. And even if a college or university has a robust, you know, like residential life program, that's good, but it's not what Newman envisioned, right, for the college and the role of the tutor within the college. When I was at the University of Mary, we started a tutorial program, but I mean, it was only just a little glimpse of the tutorial, not the way that Newman really saw it as playing that complementary role to the university. Let's read the next paragraph, because I think this will help resolve this difficulty. Such is a university in its essence, right? So its essence is to teach universal knowledge, according to Newman, and independently of its relation to the church. But practically speaking, it cannot fulfill its object duly, such as I've described it, without the church's assistance. Or, to use the theological term, the church is necessary for its integrity. Not that its main characters are changed by this incorporation. That is, the relationship to the church doesn't change what it means to be a professor, for instance. That's what he means by the characters here. It still has the office of intellectual education, but the church steadies it in the performance of that office. What do you think that adds to that first paragraph, right? Because if we just kind of stopped at the first one, you'd be like, okay, the church, the university doesn't give moral formation, but it seems necessary. How do you think this completes the picture?
It seems like the intellectual needs a guide, some guidance.
So someone, yeah, the university gives the intellectual formation. Who gives the moral formation? I think that's what he's saying here, right? Is that, and I should clarify, because what he's saying here is not just that the church can offer moral formation to students, because that would be too little. He's actually saying that through the church's moral and spiritual life, the pursuit of truth can actually come to its conclusion. That there will be a greater integrity in what the university properly aims to do, but we'll also get what is lacking from the university to complement it. Does that make sense? Any other aspects of this you want to draw out?
Yeah, it sounds like, and like it also, that steadiness and that authority frees in some way those professors as well, right? so that they
Yeah.
are truly free, and truly can do what it is that they do. It provides for them a security and a skeleton framework, right? So that they can, that paradox of the freedom of the walls, right? And then follows through the habits in the smaller community that the people living in the colleges, that what's learned in the classroom is then integrated into the day-to-day life as one makes decisions about how one lives based on what one has learned about the world, and tries things out and makes mistakes, and has a community in which to live that and develop.
I suppose it's not hard to think about what a university looks like without the church, but let's draw that out. I mean, Newman says that the university needs the church for its integrity. Why? And yeah, go ahead.
Oh, I'd like to think of this because we all have a kind of a preconceived notion of education, whatever that might be, right? And when we think of Catholic education, we immediately think of all the moral and the spiritual aspects of it. Like, well, that's just natural to it. But I like to think of taking an analogy and thinking of it like in the case of medicine, right? What is medicine in its essence, right? Medicine in its essence would be, the care for the physical health of the body, right? The care for the person. And that's what it does. That's what it's for. Just like education is for the intellectual development. But medicine requires a moral perspective, right? So it requires a moral formation to do things ethically. But even beyond that, a really good medicine, the best medicine where you really are caring for the physical person, requires an awareness that the person is integrally, body, soul, mind, and all of those things have to be attended to. And so even though the essence of medicine is to care for the body, you have to be thinking about the moral aspects of the person and the moral health of the person, which can have severe effect, right? We've got lots of studies that show that people who are living bad moral lives, it can have a severe effect on them in psychologically and physically and in other ways.
Yeah,
and
absolutely.
So the integrity of medicine depends not just on meeting the moral requirements of the church, but the awareness that this is a person and not just a physical being, and all of that has to be integrated in order to do medicine better.
Because if you were lacking in, say, an understanding of who the human person is, then it would undermine your own attempt to try to heal the body, right? And so we could think of the same thing with the teaching of knowledge, right? Without the guidance of the church, where might that go wrong? So I'll leave that out there for now, but Martin, feel free to jump in here because it looks like you're trying to get in.
Well, thanks, Jared. I think, getting back to the first point that you came up with, trying to look at this from the lens of Newman's motto, heart speaks to heart. You are talking very much about Newman establishing relationships, friendships. I watched a very beautiful video by Curtis Martin of Focus Ministries, and it was entitled How to Change the World. And he speaks about the essence of relationships between the importance of relationships in evangelization. These human bonds. It talks about Jesus being with these 12 disciples for 3 years. He knew them out, and these men were set on fire after Jesus' ascension to go out in the world and give everything they were on to spread the gospel. The other thing is, when you go back to Newman, when you look at that area of forming these deep friendships, these deep bonds, and his motto, heart speaks to heart, I think it's quite different from the modern context when you look at this compartmentalized and commercialized education, whereby it's just a matter of, you have this stuff, download it into your head. And you look at developments in technology, AI, and the transhumanism movement, whereby I think education will be reduced to mere downloading of information into your brain as such. You find that
It could be.
the element of friendship in education, I've realized of late, I've been conducting classes, and it has come to me that it's not about the subject, it's about the teacher. So Newman cares about the moral formation, and of course, the church plays a greater role, but it is highly neglected. I mean, you have a comparison, you look at what is happening in modern setting. And lastly, comparing that with Newman's need, actually, he emphasizes the need of the church. How does the church intervene in the life of the university? He calls for autonomy, but he doesn't throw the baby with the bathwater. I think you're conversant with the Land Olex statement that was issued in the United States, I think in the 70s, whereby universities generally kick the church out of education in the United States. And I think that was a very bad precedent. But here you find Newman calls for autonomy. Yes, the university must be independent of the church. At the same time, the church must be part of the university. So this integral synergy of faith and then reason.
Yeah, and I think that's part of what Newman's saying with the integrity, that if you get rid of faith, will reason maintain its integrity? All right, I think that's one of the key aspects here. And we can even think of medicine, right? Is medicine just information, or is there a formation of mind that is needed even there? I had a principal tell me once, why do you keep talking about wisdom? My nurse doesn't need wisdom. She just needs to know how to do the job. And I said, well, if your nurse lacks wisdom, she might kill you. So yeah, what do you think about that claim that, the church certainly offers moral and spiritual formation, but Newman goes farther than that to say that the church is needed for the integrity of the university's own task. Excuse me. What do you think about that? How will the university's task of imparting universal knowledge be undermined without the church? Like I said, it shouldn't be too hard to look around and see that either.
I think that there's, if I don't recall wrongly, in the fall, when Adam and Eve, they fell, but before the fall, actually, they supposedly had this gift of integrity, right? And it meant that everything was in the right order, and there was a kind of hierarchy, like the passions were not insubordinated, they were subordinated to the reason. So there's like this hierarchy that I think that it broke after the fall. And I don't know if maybe that's kind of the image Newman is using, like without the wisdom of the church, we lose the integrity of how all the subjects of the university have a proper place, and there's a hierarchy. And just like Patrick said, if not, then one science might behave like it's the king or the queen when it's not, and it has to know its proper place and kind of submit to kind of greater knowledges. That's what I think.
So giving a broader vision of reality, and that relates to what Denise put in the chat box here. I don't know if you want to say anything farther about that. Maybe not. I don't know. And feel free to jump in, anybody here too.
No, that's exactly what I said.
Yes. Yeah.
The church has the ultimate truth, and the whole essence, the whole purpose of a university is the acquisition of knowledge in and its reality of the truth. And when I look at truth, I think of truth in Jesus Christ, the ultimate truth. And the whole aim of education and Catholic education is that transcendence to the truth. So that faith and reason, they balance each other, and they harmonize, or they should harmonize. And anyway, that's
Thank you.
what I want to add.
This connects to Denise's point. Don Briel's introduction talked a bit about one of Newman's homilies. And like the line that really struck me in the homily was when Newman pointed out that if you separate the church and the university, you end up with all of these competing influences. And I loved that he used the term like influences, because I think that's what I see in the modern university, where different professors just become essentially influencers. Different disciplines, different professors will have different opinions and different sorts of influences over different students. And you can kind of select into who influences you, as opposed to there being this central unity of truth that all knowledge is supposed to point to. And I think that tends to undermine the belief in truth, like just an underlying belief in truth, like the fact that different disciplines, different professors will offer different perspectives to begin with. But I think it also undermines the idea of there even being a unity of truth, even if it's not God. Like there is a certain unity to truth.
And Newman's going to talk about that at length, right? That if God and the church are pushed out of the university, well, then it can't be what it is called to be. That is a place that teaches universal knowledge, because some knowledge is being excluded, right? So we're going to spend a lot of time thinking about that. All right, I want to turn to pages 10 and 11. And so if you are in a different version, this is still in the preface, about, well, I'd say a little bit more than halfway through. I want to look at, and this is even going back to the bottom of page 9, what Newman means when he talks about the culture of the intellect. That's a term from Cicero. So the bottom of 9, he talks about that, but the quote I want to read is on the top of page 10, but it's in that same paragraph. So what are these advantages? So look for that paragraph if you have a different version. The end of that paragraph, it says, okay, well, I'll read the whole sentence because it's hard to jump in. Our desideratum is not the manners and habits of gentlemen. These can be and are acquired in various other ways, by good society, by foreign travel, by the innate grace and dignity of the Catholic mind. But the force, the steadiness, the comprehensiveness, and the versatility of intellect, the command over our own powers, the instinctive just estimate of things as they pass before us, which sometimes indeed is a natural gift, but commonly is not gained without much effort in the exercise of years. This is the real cultivation of mind. Right, so I think it's important just to kind of think about these points, right? That there is a kind of force and power of the intellect that steadies it, that is comprehensive and versatile, that actually gives us command over our powers, and we might think, therefore, might play into the moral life. The just estimate of things. Let's look on the next page. And so this is 1, 2, 3 paragraphs following that one on page 11 in the Cluny edition. When the intellect has once been properly trained and formed to have a connected view or grasp of things, it will display its powers with more or less effect according to its particular quality and capacity in the individual. In the case of most men, it makes itself felt in the good sense, sobriety of thought, reasonableness, candor, self-command, and steadiness of view which characterize it. So between these two passages, I think we're starting to get an idea of the kind of intellectual formation that Newman thinks will happen for students as they are pursuing, right, this study of knowledge. So what stands out to you here, right? When you think of what is education for? What is university education for in particular? What do you think about that in regards to what Newman is saying in these two passages?
I'd say it's geared less towards being skilled in a profession, for example, and it's more about being a holistic whole being under God as well. It's kind of part of just like a mind, body, spirit formation that sort of touches all areas of our life.
So it's a fundamental point that it's not the ability to do something, but Newman is saying it's a cultivation of self, right? And in particular,
it's to be.
Yeah, exactly. Is much more human, right? To become human, Shauna says. And that's why we talk about studying the humanities, right? The humane learning to enrich our humanity. So a lot of times today, and Newman talks about this in the first discourse, actually, everybody wants education to be useful, right? What are you going to do with it? And when you read this list, I mean, it is useful, but not in a practical sense, right? But in the sense of, well, I'm actually able to live rightly, and that helps me in whatever I would do, anything, right? But that the goal is not to do something outside of myself. The goal is to be cultivated within myself.
I'm not sure that this is entirely as unuseful as it used to be. Good sense, sobriety of thought, reasonableness, candor, self-command. These aren't readily traits that our society fosters at all. I mean, it's not as, we're a long way from this,
Perhaps we have a breakdown in education.
Maybe, right? I mean, I'm voting for this being, it makes a much better world, right?
Yeah, absolutely.
So even having these skills is
why should we take time for the liberal arts, for humane learning, right? What is the purpose of this? Does it really matter? And I think Newman is saying, yeah, it does matter. It's something I skipped over, but this is, we started reading in that one paragraph, what are these advantages? And the next paragraph is, this is the real cultivation of mind. But about 6 lines down, it says, it brings the mind into form, for the mind is like the body. Boys outgrow their shape and their strength. Their limbs have to be knit together, and their constitution needs tone. Mistaking animal spirits for vigor, and overconfident in their health, ignorant what they can bear and how they can manage themselves, they are immoderate and extravagant and fall into sharp sicknesses. Sounds like my 16-year-old son. This is an emblem of their minds. At first, they have no principles laid down within them. True. As a foundation for the intellect to build upon. They have no discriminating convictions and no grasp or consequences. And therefore, they talk at random if they talk much, and cannot help being flippant, or what is emphatically called young. They are merely dazzled by phenomena. And of course, Newman had no idea by all the phenomena that we're dazzled by, instead of perceiving things as they are. What a powerful passage there.
Yeah, can I speak to the whole thing about gentlemen, right? Of course, he's talking about all male education at this time, right? But so you could say gentleman, lady, same idea. But I remember seeing a lecture that I don't remember who it was. It was a former president of Harvard University, and basically extolling Newman and talking about Harvard as sort of the epitome of Newman's thought, right? And he was going on about how Harvard was forming the gentleman that was the height of what Newman was calling for. And I see why to me it's a little confusing the way he he kind of bounces back and forth a little bit. But the way I read this is he's not, the gentleman is sort of that base. He says, yes, that someone coming out of having this kind of education is going to have those characteristics of the gentleman, right? Being patient, being willing to listen, sort of all of those intellectual virtues that help someone to be a good intellectual, or to be able to engage in some kind of dialogue. But he seems to also be saying that's not really what I'm really aiming for, right? That the purpose of education is to cultivate the mind, to be able to think reasonably, and to have those, to be able to use that power of reasoning effectively, and not just to be the kind of person who has the behaviors that lend to good dialogue, but actually to be someone who can truly think and reason above what maybe the normal person. He talks later about viewiness, right? These people who they're very articulate, and they can talk about things, and they can talk about just about anything, right? So they have some of that, what he's talking about, but ultimately they're not necessarily very strong in their thought, and able to really come to rational conclusions. And it seems to me that that's ultimately what he's aiming for.
Yeah, and so what he says in the passage we read is that we're not aiming at the manners and habits of gentlemen, right? So not simply to be able to rub shoulders in polite society, or to have social graces. But perhaps what he's saying is that to be a true gentleman is to have the kind of refinement of mind, that someone is really kind of chiseled into manhood, and that is not the ultimate goal of human life, but that kind of refinement is the goal of the university. And once again, and when Newman says university, he's thinking that should exist alongside of the college, right? And so the college, in Newman's mind, should be a very religious place, and it should be a place where we're really aiming to be saints. So what is the ultimate goal for Newman? It's not to stop at the quality of being a gentleman, but I think he's pushing on what that means, right? To truly be a gentleman, because it isn't, the stereotype of the English gentleman, right? We just want all of our students in Ireland to turn out like them, No. So I think he's beginning to tell us what he thinks that term really means, and it's not something superficial, right? It's not just the manners and habits on the outside. So there's a couple of layers here, right? He's telling us what the cultivation of the mind looks like. That's what he's aiming at. And I think he's saying that that's what a true gentleman would be. But because there needs to be a complementary formation from the church, we're ultimately looking even farther than that in this formation.
Section you read sounds almost to me like the formation of prudence, which is an intellectual virtue, but it's also what gives form to the moral virtues. So that makes me think of like the complementarity of the church and the university right there. If the university can help build prudence, that would automatically assist the moral virtues as well.
Yeah, I think there's an element of that. I don't think it's restricted to it, but I do think that insofar as prudence is able to draw from knowledge and good intellectual habits and apply them to the moral life, I do think that is one point of connection. So I think you're right about that. But I think ultimately, he is getting at a kind of habit of thought here. Or we could say, I think it's beautiful, he says in 11, to have a connected view or grasp of things. It's common today to kind of talk about having a Catholic worldview, right, in education. And so knowledge on its own could simply be piecemeal, right? But if we talk about a connected view of things, I think that helps us to go farther.
Yeah, just to hop in here. I think about that in terms of Newman coming to Ireland at a time whereby there was this anti-Catholic environment, and Ireland had just been through this great depression, the Irish famine, and it wasn't good times. So the Catholic Church is trying to get on its feet, and he wants to go beyond the mere formation of men for the trades, but he wants to form men who are complete, and to enable human flourishing that he visions in the idea of university is very important. It's very important for us actually to also consider to go back in time and look through the lens of Catholic of Ireland, then see, okay, why is Newman trying to talk about this? What is he trying to bring in? And I think it can give us a very great idea. So let us not have that picture out the history of Ireland, the anti-Catholic environment, and what else, and his background. I think it can inform us on this very point.
Yeah, because essentially, I think one of the things that he's arguing in the first discourse is that without university education, the young men, because the university at this point would have been for men, but the young men who would be leaders in amongst Irish Catholics would not have the kind of cultivation of the intellect that he's describing here. And so how would they in that environment be able to contend with those who are trained at Oxford and Cambridge, or, even if you look within Dublin itself, right, at the Protestant universities that were in Ireland? How would the young men really be able to stand on their own 2 feet against those who have had that experience? So I know we talk a lot about, forming leaders, but I think, that's what Newman is trying to do here, right? Okay, now in Discourse 1, Newman has to do another little apologia, right? Because he says, okay, I'm writing based on my own experience of education, which happened at Protestant Oxford. And that is what really shaped how I think about what a university is. And he says, now that I've become Catholic, my views of what a university is have not changed, right? My view has not changed. Although I have a greater conviction, he said, as a Catholic. And what he wants to say is, don't hate me, not only because I'm English, but also because I have this background in Protestant education. And he actually says that the principles of education are natural and they're not revealed. So that you could have a university which is Protestant, or in his whole rise of the universities that he wrote about, that he went back to Athens and he looks at the museum, the school which was in Alexandria, as some kind of like prototypes of the university. So he said, simply the pursuit of universal knowledge is not something that has been revealed by God, right? The nature of the university is not revealed by God. It arises from the principles of nature itself. And that doesn't mean that the church isn't important for its integrity to assist it in that task, but the university itself is natural, not supernatural. What do you think of that particular claim, right? Did that kind of rub anybody the wrong way, or do you kind of see what he's trying to draw out here? This is, for instance, on page 18, right? It is natural to expect this from the very circumstance that the philosophy of education is founded on truths in the natural order. Skipping down about 6-7 lines here. It is in this way that Catholics stand relatively to Protestants in the science of education. Protestants, depending on human means mainly, are led to make the most of them. Their sole resource is to use what they have. Knowledge is their power and nothing else. They are anxious cultivators of a rugged soil. It is otherwise than us, because he says we have a goodly heritage. So Protestants can have a university, and sometimes he says they're better at running a university because they're just trying to make the most of running it on a natural level. But he says we're blessed with this great inheritance, even from the medieval universities. But he's kind of looking around, right? You think of the University of Paris, it's been secularized by his time. Sapientia in Rome has been secularized. And so Catholic university education was having a pretty hard time in the 19th century. And so this is part of the reason why I think Newman is speaking in those terms. But what do you think about that claim, though, about that he's primarily writing about natural principles in this work?
I would, if I could go back to the analogy with medicine, I just
Sure,
find
yeah.
it useful, right? If you want someone to be a good doctor, right, you can make all the arguments that being a good doctor, the integrity of that must involve the church and the understanding of our faith and all of that. And yet they need to learn how to fix a wound, right? They need to learn about the physical aspects of the body. They need to learn their trade. And so, I think his point is that if education is in its essence about formation of the mind, it's going to be done rightly together with the church, but it does entail a natural and very, just real aspect of learning practically how to cultivate reason and how to develop the mind. And arguably, as the classical movement today, tries to make the point that some of the best development of that was all the way back with the Greeks and the Romans before, Christ was even here.
Mm-hmm.
I would argue that it was developed much further with Catholic education going into at least the Middle Ages, but that's a natural human progression and wasn't a theological development.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and in that sense, if university education aims at the learning, the pursuit of universal knowledge, and it aims at a cultivation of the mind itself, he's saying that is not something that is exclusive to Catholics, even if we might be able to do it better. I think that's part of what he's implying here, right? The Protestants are relying on natural means alone, which is ironic, right? Because anyway, from a Protestant perspective, right, they would say they're all about grace, but he's saying, no, they're just on their own, trying to do university education the best that they can. But he's saying, with grace, we can do it even better than they can. Not because the lectures would be different. To go back to even, what you were saying about medicine, right? To treat a wound would be the same at a Protestant university versus a Catholic university. So what would be different? Well, it would be the study of Catholic theology alongside of the pursuit of medicine. And then it would also be the moral and spiritual formation that was imparted through the church in conjunction with university teaching, right? If we're trying to look at this whole picture. But he's going to go back, though, and say, okay, but the task of education itself is a natural task, right? It flows from the natural law.
And grace builds on nature.
Absolutely.
So, I mean, if you want to perfect grace, it helps to perfect nature before you do it. So,
yeah, and I think if that was not the case, I think what he implies here is that, well, maybe we wouldn't even need universities as Catholics, right? If grace was just enough, we could just go to Mass and receive the sacraments, we wouldn't need a university. But I think what he's saying is, no, actually, this cultivation of mind is very important for the life of the church. Does that make sense to everyone? One of the things I just wanted to make sure we hit here at the end as well is, as somebody who's helped to found a few schools, that he hits on the point starting on page 21, but this is number 4 in the first discourse here, of just how difficult it is, right? And then I mentioned that, things did not go as Newman expected. Imagine that the bishops didn't deliver everything that he hoped that they would deliver. And that they went too slow, and that they didn't appreciate his means all the time and thought he was a little too loose with the students and all these kinds of things, right? But he really is pushing up against what people thought about, maybe you could even say, the futility of this task, right? Is this really necessary? Do we really need, at this point in time, right? We have Catholic emancipation. There's already Protestant universities out there. Do we really need to go through the effort, the expense of establishing a Catholic university in the British Isles? Is it really worth it? And I want to talk about that because I hear that all the time, that kind of attitude, right? Is it really worth it? Is it worth it? You could even say, for me to send my kids to a Catholic school, right? Is that worth it? Is it worth it for us to continue to operate these very expensive institutions? He also looks at, and this is going back to page 16, the fact that people said that these schools were not useful enough, or that it doesn't make sense to have a religious institution in modern culture any longer, right? That these institutions, he said, should not be religiously exclusive, right? And that's what he's saying, that it shouldn't just be a Catholic university. So I really appreciate, him kind of ending with those difficulties, because he suffered a lot for this project. Even after he left, he continued to suffer for it. And he hits on even the whole tradition of Irish and British monks suffering in all of their travels throughout the mainland, establishing these schools and being overrun by barbarians and then starting the schools again, right? The church has gone to a lot of effort to establish centers of learning. Is it really worth it, right? Especially, you just said, this is primarily a natural endeavor, right? To cultivate the mind. And it's really hard and difficult, right? So why do we do it? Why does the church run educational institutions despite all of these difficulties?
Yesterday, I launched a WhatsApp group of about 13 friends in the traditional community. And one of the things that came to my mind, we celebrated the feast of Corpus Christi, and it was the Gospel of John, chapter 13, verse 13. So Nicodemus encounters Jesus, and Jesus tells Nicodemus, "So you call me teacher and Lord, Dominus et Magister." Magister et Domini. One difference that you get to notice within the Catholic circles, and especially when you look at the classical approach to education, is this fullness of education that it does, if I quote Pope John Paul's opening remarks in his encyclical, Fides et Ratio, that faith and reason, faith gives wings to reason, and in so doing, it helps one to know God, and in knowing oneself, you know others better, and it's in a way, it does open us to serving others in the greatest way possible. So the Catholic education and human flourishing, are we living to optimal? In the computer world, I've had a friend who is a in the computer
We are
world,
running out of
and,
time, so just yeah.
okay. Efficiency. How could we be more efficient? And we realize that at the end of the day, we aren't just mere mortals. What is the end of man? And does this education lead us to the greatest truth?
Yeah. That, otherwise it might be incomplete, right? And that there's something essential that would be missing to go to a Protestant or secular university. All right, we have time for just one more comment, but brief, since we are running out of time. If someone else wants to jump in here.
Actually, one comment I wanted to make is a lot of this seems to be very related to what Joseph Pieper says about the idea of philosophy itself, where what he says about philosophy is that that you cannot leave anything out of it. And that includes theological questions such, because there's been this attempt to sort of try to separate philosophy from religion and from theological matters. But what Pieper says is that actually works against philosophy, because philosophy has to include everything. And that includes religious belief or thought and such. And I think that maybe that's sort of what Newman is talking about as well, where what a Catholic university can do is it can ensure that everything is brought in, because if it's a Protestant university, clearly is not going to bring in Catholic thought, and for a Catholic, that's an important part of their knowledge, which is why it's really important to have something that's separate.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, thank you for that. And that's a great preview to where we're going next, because that's what Newman's going to move into in the coming discourses. So one of the things I'm going to try to do, I'm going to work on this over the weekend, is try to just put together some study questions to think about before we meet again next week, so that we'll be even more prepared for the discussion. So I'll put out some of the things that we're going to talk about. And yeah, Patrick, I've certainly seen that a lot as well, that we can get really exhausted, and priests can even be afraid of the amount of work that goes into Catholic education. And I know it from experience, right? But it is worth it. Absolutely. So it was really great to be with you here for our first session. I look forward to seeing you all next week. So let's end with prayer. In the name of the Father, Son, and Holy Spirit. Amen. Glory be to the Father, and to the Son, and to the Holy Spirit, as it was in the beginning, is now, and ever shall be, world without end. Amen. St. John Henry Newman, pray for us. In the name of the Father, Son, and Holy Spirit. Amen. All right. Good night, everybody.